Just before dawn, on a cold December morning, one leak cut straight into the heart of the monarchy. Within minutes, the palace was in quiet chaos, but only two names were whispered with real fear. And 5 minutes ago, Sarah Ferguson walked into Royal Lodge, demanding an answer only Andrew could give. The leak that should never have happened. It happened with the strange stillness that always surrounds early winter mornings, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, as though the world itself is listening. It was just after the first hour of the morning on December 5th, when the status of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor shifted from precarious to catastrophic. The palace switchboard lit up in a single bright strike, the way it only does when something has escaped the walls that were meant to contain it. A senior official from a national paper had called demanding confirmation of a classified internal memo concerning Andrew and the looming financial review scheduled for the second half of January. The memo in question was supposed to be confined to a distribution list of fewer than a dozen trusted names. And yet there it was, quoted back to a stunned palace aide word for word. The language of the memo was clinical and cold. It detailed a series of possible relocation scenarios for Andrew should he fail to meet specific obligations by mid-January. It referenced recent logistical assessments, the potential withdrawal of remaining security allowances, and a stark note about a temporary residence being prepared should Royal Lodge be formally reclaimed by the Crown Estate. Yet the most damaging part was not the content itself. It was the implication of how it had left the building. Leaks of this nature are not simply accidents. They do not slip through clerical errors or errant emails. They come from intention, from a person who knows the architecture of the palace well enough to pierce it. And because this was not the first time confidential matters involving Andrew had surfaced unexpectedly, the senior staff felt a familiar sense of dread. It was the dread of patterns returning, the dread of reputational threads being tugged free until an entire fabric came apart. The internal team was mobilized within minutes. The communications office was placed on alert. Security reviews began, and digital access logs were pulled up one by one. In the first hour after discovery, the palace was convinced it was dealing with an external interception. Perhaps a compromised device, perhaps an opportunistic breach. But then the timeline snapped into place. The memo had only been circulated the previous afternoon. Only a small circle had viewed it, and the language quoted in the call had included an internal annotation, a note appended by a senior aide which should never have been visible to anyone outside the tightest ring of the royal household. That detail changed everything. It meant the leak came from inside, someone who had access to materials that have historically been treated with the caution of state secrets. Someone who understood the political and personal ramifications of exposing Andrew's precarious position ahead of the review. It was the type of breach that signals motive, a motive not simply to disseminate information, but to destabilize a figure who was already drowning. The palace initiated a quiet crisis protocol, the type that leaves no paper trail and is known only to those inside the circle. Phones were collected, assistants were summoned. Senior figures were alerted in discreet messages, written with the practiced restraint of people accustomed to managing disaster. The protocol, in its essence, was straightforward. Identify the source, contain the damage, prepare for the next blow. But the moment the internal list of possible suspects was formed, one name rose higher than the rest by virtue of proximity and historical entanglements. Not as a culprit necessarily, but as someone who would inevitably be pulled into the center of the fallout. Sarah Ferguson, the woman who had weathered more storms tied to Andrew than any other person in his life. The woman who had, against expectation, lived with him for decades in the uneven peace of Royal Lodge. The woman who was most closely connected to the rhythms of his world. What no one inside the palace realized yet was that Sarah had already been told. Not by the palace, not by advisors, but by someone outside the inner circle who had reached her before the official machinery even fully recognized what had happened. And it was that early knowledge that would propel her into a confrontation that had been silently building for weeks. Sarah hears the news first. Sarah Ferguson was awake far earlier than she wished to be. It had been that way for days. Ever since the November 27th ruling that had stripped her of long-standing royal provisions and forced her into a rapid recalibration of what stability meant. She had been attempting to write when her phone buzzed with the persistent vibration that only came from one of two people. It was a long-time aide, the sort who did not call in the early morning unless the world had tilted. When Sarah answered, the voice on the other end did not even attempt to soften the blow. A leak. A serious one. A memo with language that could only have come from the highest levels inside the palace. And at the center of it all, Andrew. The same man whose life had been spiraling in quiet circles for weeks, yet who remained convinced that the walls of Royal Lodge kept the outside world at bay. Sarah felt something inside her still. Not exactly. Something colder. Something heavier. She closed her eyes as the aide read fragments of the memo. Mandatory relocation reviews, financial compliance deadlines, temporary housing scenarios, and the worst line of all was the assessment from palace legal staff that Andrew's remaining arrangements were now officially considered unstable. The aide continued speaking, but Sarah had drifted somewhere else entirely. She was remembering conversations from late November, words spoken with unease, staff members who seemed afraid to repeat themselves. She recalled Andrew pacing the drawing room the night after the palace announcement concerning Sarah had gone public. He had insisted the institution was collapsing into fear-based decision-making. He had insisted leaks were becoming currency for those wanting power. She had dismissed the remark at the time as frustration. Now she wondered if it had been something else. Sarah placed the phone on the table beside her and sat completely still. She knew immediately what the leak meant. Not in the political sense, not in the media sense, but in the personal sense that carried far deeper weight. It meant the institution no longer trusted Andrew. It meant they were bracing for impact, and it meant that whoever released that memo wanted to weaken him before the review could even begin. But something else pierced through her thinking, something far more unsettling. The leak contained internal annotations, details only visible to a minuscule number of palace staff. Details Andrew himself had referenced casually in a conversation with her on December 2nd. A conversation she had dismissed as idle frustration. But now she realized there had been discrepancies in his timeline, gaps he had waved off, comments that had seemed oddly rehearsed. Sarah rose from her chair, every movement precise. She understood what the palace would do next. They would search for a motive. They would search for a trail. And because the November 27th ruling had already shaken the ground beneath her feet, the timing of the leak would raise uncomfortable questions. She reached for her coat, knowing she had only one viable path. She had to speak to Andrew before the palace reached him. She had to hear directly from the man who had, in his own way, woven her into decades of disaster and redemption. And she had to determine, before anyone else could, whether this leak was accidental collateral damage or something tied far closer to home. As she stepped out into the brittle cold of the early morning, Sarah felt the familiar tightening across her chest, the kind she had felt at every major turning point in Andrew's life, every scandal, every reckoning, every directive that came down from the highest levels of the monarchy. But today felt different, because today she was not stepping into a crisis merely as his former wife or as the mother of his children. Today, she was stepping into the center of a rupture that threatened to redefine both his future and her own, and she no longer knew if she was walking toward clarity or toward the collapse of everything they had managed to preserve. Inside Royal Lodge, Andrew's denial. Sarah's breakthrough Royal Lodge had always held an uneasy stillness. It was a house built for ceremony, yet burdened with the weight of silence. When Sarah arrived, the light was dim through the windows and the chill of the December morning clung to the corridors. She did not wait for an invitation. She had lived here for more years than she could easily count, and formality had long since slipped away. Andrew was in the study, wearing the expression he often wore when he believed he still controlled the narrative. He looked up with a mixture of confusion and irritation as she entered, but Sarah did not give him time to speak. She closed the door behind her and delivered the news in the same measured tone used by palace officials when announcing that consequences were no longer avoidable. He stared at her as though she had spoken in another language, a leak, a memo, internal annotations. Then he stood abruptly, insisting this was another assault by what he called the palace apparatus. He claimed there were individuals determined to dismantle what remained of his position. He claimed the timing was too coordinated to be coincidence. Sarah let him speak. She let him pace. She let the defensiveness unravel across his face. And then she stepped closer, lowering her voice with a precision that made him stop moving. She told him she had seen signs before, slips in conversations. Staff members departed rooms as she entered. References he made on December 2nd that should not have been possible unless he had read something more detailed than what had been officially shared with him. She recounted moments that taken alone were meaningless, but taken together, formed the outline of a truth she had refused to examine. Andrew hesitated. It was only for a breath, but it was enough. Sarah had known him for decades. She could read him the way one reads the weather, and she saw something flicker across his face that did not belong to innocence or outrage. It belonged to fear. He tried to regain control, arguing that the leak must have come from senior palace officials who wanted to weaken him. Sarah did not contradict him. Instead, she asked a question sharp enough to puncture the air between them. Had he spoken to anyone outside the permitted circle about the memo? Had he expressed frustration to any former staff members? Had he repeated details in a moment of anger or desperation? Andrew's reaction was immediate and loud. He insisted he had done nothing wrong. He insisted he had been careful. He insisted he understood better than anyone how precarious his position had become. But Sarah did not move. She simply watched him. And in the long quiet that followed his outburst, Andrew looked away first. Sarah pressed further. She explained what the palace believed, that someone close to him was attempting to create leverage, someone who wanted public sympathy before the January review, someone who wanted to paint him as embattled and mistreated, the kind of narrative that spreads quickly and influences decisions behind closed doors. He paled. The words sympathy leverage struck him in a way nothing else had. He whispered that he had never intended harm, that he had only wanted the institution to understand the pressure he had been under, that he had not realized how his words or frustrations might have been interpreted if repeated without context. The room seemed to contract around them. It was the moment Sarah had feared, the moment when the possibility of unintentional complicity became real. Andrew sank into the nearest chair, hands trembling slightly. He spoke of the November decisions relating to Sarah. He spoke of the humiliations he felt. He spoke of believing that the palace no longer cared about nuance or humanity. And in that desperation, he admitted he might have confided in someone he should not have trusted. Sarah did not react immediately. She absorbed every word with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial. And then she said something that shifted the entire direction of their morning. She told him that the palace already suspected that very scenario. Andrew inhaled sharply. The color drained further from his face. And for the first time since she had entered the study, there was no anger in him. Only the awareness that his world had shifted again and that he might have played a part in the collapse. The silence that followed was not merely uncomfortable, it was historic, the kind of silence that signals the beginning of an unraveling. The hidden motive nobody wanted to discuss. There are truths within the royal household that are spoken only behind sealed doors and in voices stripped of sentiment. One of those truths concerned the fear that Andrew had begun searching for narrative protection in the court of public opinion. Senior advisors had discussed it in restrained tones for weeks. They believed he might attempt to secure sympathy ahead of the January review. They believed he might use private frustrations to shape a public plea. and they believed such a move could destabilize not only his immediate circumstances, but the institution itself. Sarah understood this more deeply than Andrew realized. She had watched the palace's posture evolve since late November. She recognized the signs of a system preparing for self-preservation, and she had witnessed the subtle ways senior figures shifted from defensive concern to active suspicion. The leak confirmed what everyone inside the palace had feared, that someone connected to Andrew, intentionally or not, had provided ammunition to forces waiting for vulnerability. She looked at Andrew with an expression that carried both history and exhaustion. She explained that the palace did not think he orchestrated the leak directly. They believed he had said too much to someone he thought was loyal, someone who had their own motivations, someone who interpreted his frustration as an invitation to act. Andrew shook his head repeatedly, insisting he did not want public pity. He insisted he wanted only clarity and fairness. But Sarah countered with precision. She reminded him of remarks he made after the November 27th directive concerning her. Remarks about wanting the world to understand how broken the system had become. Remarks about rewriting perception. Remarks about narrative power. Andrew buried his face in his hands. His voice dropped to a whisper when he finally spoke. He confessed that after the ruling that stripped Sarah of her provisions, he had spiraled emotionally. He felt helpless, humiliated, and increasingly convinced that his attempts at cooperation were meaningless. He had reached out to a former staff member, he admitted, seeking reassurance. He told this person that the palace did not grasp how unstable he felt. He told them that decisions were being made without compassion, and he feared that he had said enough for this person to piece together details about the memo once the initial whispers circulated. Sarah closed her eyes. It was the closest Andrew had come to admitting possible responsibility. Not responsibility for a deliberate leak, but responsibility for creating fertile ground in which a leak could grow. The palace would not differentiate between intentional and accidental. They would only see consequences. She asked Andrew why he had not spoken to her instead. He looked up, eyes strained, and said he had been ashamed. He did not want her to see how diminished he felt. He did not want to admit how lost he had become. And above all, he did not want to risk making her position worse after what she had endured in November. Sarah felt something unexpected then. Not sympathy exactly, something closer to grief. The grief of witnessing a man who had never learned how to carry his own consequences. The grief of seeing how desperation had caused him to reach for the wrong person at the wrong time. And the grief of understanding how predictable this collapse had been. She told him the palace would act swiftly, that once they linked his private conversations to the timeline of the leak, they would assume motive, they would assume strategy, they would assume intent. And the review in January would shift from procedural to punitive. Andrew stood slowly, as though gravity itself had changed. He moved to the window and stared out at the grounds that had once symbolized safety. He whispered that he had never imagined Royal Lodge could be taken from him. He whispered that he had lived most of his adult life believing the monarchy would protect him from his own mistakes, and he whispered that he had misjudged the depth of the institution's exhaustion with him. Sarah stepped closer but did not touch him. Instead, she asked the question that no one else would dare ask. Had he wanted the public to feel sorry for him? Andrew did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice cracked. He admitted he had wanted understanding, not pity, but he acknowledged that the line between those two desires had blurred during his most desperate moments. It was enough. Enough for Sarah to understand the palace would not see nuance. Enough for her to know she had to protect their daughters. Enough for her to realize the coming days would reshape everything. The daughter question. Beatrice and Eugenie pulled into the storm. The palace had already begun its second phase of response long before Andrew and Sarah reached the point of truth. The leak was no longer considered a single incident. It was now officially categorized as a breach affecting future security and financial oversight decisions. And whenever oversight is mentioned within the royal household, it inevitably touches the princesses. Sarah broke the news to Andrew with visible reluctance. Palace legal staff had reached out quietly to request clarifying statements from both Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie regarding their involvement or knowledge of any information circulation. The request was not accusatory, but it was unprecedented. It implied that the palace believed the daughters might possess information relevant to the internal inquiry. Andrew reacted instantly. His face hardened, his posture stiffened, and his voice rose in indignation. He insisted that Beatrice and Eugenie had nothing to do with the leak. He insisted they would never betray family trust. But Sarah interrupted gently, explaining that this was not about betrayal. It was about procedure. The palace was fortifying itself, and families become collateral damage in such moments. She reminded Andrew of the temporary accommodations being prepared for them should Royal Lodge be reclaimed. She explained that the leak jeopardized those arrangements. If the palace believed Andrew was connected, intentionally or inadvertently, they might suspend decisions affecting the princesses until the full investigation concluded. And suspension, in palace language, often means indefinite delay. Andrew sank back into his chair. It was the second time that morning he appeared significantly older than his years. He whispered that he could not allow his daughters to suffer because of something he had said carelessly in anger or pain. Sarah sat across from him, her own expression strained. She had been thinking of their daughters since the moment she left her home earlier that morning. Beatrice, the diplomat in domestic shoes, Eugenie, the quiet architect of family peace. Both had spent weeks preparing for the outcome of the November 27th ruling. Both had taken on logistical burdens that ought never to have fallen on their shoulders. And now another storm was pulling them into its center. She told Andrew in plain terms that their daughters deserved better than this narrative. She told him that the palace would not hesitate to use the appearance of impropriety as a justification for stricter measures. She told him that the only way to protect them was full transparency. Andrew seemed to fight internally with that idea. Transparency had never served him well in the past. He had always been more comfortable with selective revelation, but this time, the stakes had shifted. The institution was no longer acting from cautious patience. It was acting from institutional fatigue. The daughters, he said softly, must be kept outside the blast radius. Sarah agreed, but she added something more. She said that even if he did not want to answer to palace officials, he owed answers to his family. Their daughters had spent years trying to rebuild a sense of dignity around their father. They had stood by him when public opinion hardened. They had shielded him from headlines, and they had taken quiet blows on his behalf that he never fully saw. If the palace decided the leak suggested recklessness or strategic manipulation, it would affect not only him, but them, their futures, their housing arrangements, their financial protections, their standing within an institution that values order above affection. Andrew leaned back and closed his eyes as though bracing himself against a wave of cold air. He admitted he had not realized the potential scope of damage. He admitted he had believed the leak would simply spark temporary embarrassment. He admitted he never imagined his daughters could be drawn into an official inquiry. Sarah did not scold him. There was no point. Instead, she spoke in the steady tone of someone who had already walked through this kind of fire. She said the leak was no longer about public perception. It was about institutional trust. And trust, once broken, rarely returns. Andrew whispered that he would do whatever was necessary to shield Beatrice and Eugenie. Sarah nodded, but added that doing what is necessary meant telling the truth now before the palace forced it from him later. The realization struck him like a physical blow. The final blow, Sarah's ultimatum, and the palace's next move. The morning light had shifted by the time Sarah delivered her ultimatum. It filtered through the windows in long, thin bands that made the study feel colder than before. Andrew sat rigid in his chair, his hands clasped tightly as though they were trying to anchor him to reality. Sarah stood before him not as a former spouse nor as a long-suffering companion. She stood as someone who understood the institution far better than he did, someone who knew how the palace interprets silence, someone who knew what happened when officials believed there were gaps in a narrative. She told him in unambiguous terms that he had only one path left. He must cooperate fully with palace investigators. He must recount every conversation he had engaged in since late November. He must reveal the identity of the former staff member he had confided in. And he must clarify the exact words he used, because language is everything in these inquiries. Andrew looked at her with genuine fear. He admitted he had never intended to influence anything. He had spoken recklessly, yes, but not strategically. But Sarah did not soften. She explained that intention does not matter in the palace. Impact does. And the impact of the leak was enormous. He asked quietly what would happen if he refused. Sarah did not hesitate. She told him she would step away, fully, publicly if necessary, not out of anger but out of self-preservation and for the protection of their children. If he refused transparency, she could not attach herself to the fallout that would inevitably follow. Andrew inhaled sharply as though the room had lost all oxygen. He whispered that her departure would destroy whatever remained of his stability. Sarah countered that his refusal to cooperate would destroy both of them. There was a long silence. Then Andrew finally surrendered to the truth he had spent the entire morning resisting. He admitted that on December 2nd, he had spoken to a former staff member. He admitted he had expressed fears and frustrations. He admitted he had referenced the memo even though he was not supposed to. He admitted his words could easily have been interpreted as an invitation to intervene. It was not a confession of guilt, but it was an admission of involvement, and Sarah knew immediately that the palace would seize upon it. She told him the palace was preparing an official bulletin for December 6th. The inquiry would be formalized, the review process would be expanded, and his previously scheduled January evaluation would now include an integrity assessment, the kind of assessment that rarely ends in mercy. Andrew's shoulders sagged forward. He whispered that he never meant for any of this to happen. Sarah believed him, but belief was no longer relevant. The palace cared about data, timelines, and consequences. She walked toward the door, her breath steady, but her heart heavy. She paused only once to tell him that this moment could still be redirected if he chose transparency. But if he chose denial, he would stand alone. She left the study without waiting for his answer. Outside, the air felt sharper. She walked down the corridor of Royal Lodge in slow, measured steps, absorbing the finality of what had unfolded. She did not look back. There was nothing left to salvage at that moment. Andrew remained inside the study, staring at the door long after it closed. He understood now that the leak had not only exposed a memo, it had exposed his vulnerability, his desperation, and his misjudgment, and the inquiry that awaited him would not treat those flaws gently. The palace, meanwhile, was already drafting its statement. Officials were gathering notes, strategies were being aligned, and somewhere inside those halls, a narrative was forming. A narrative that would define Andrew in ways he could no longer control. The day had begun with a leak. It ended with the first fracture in the fragile alliance between Sarah and Andrew. And by the next morning, the monarchy would quietly brace itself for the fallout of a family that had once again fractured under the weight of its own shadows. In the quiet corners of the monarchy, where truth is often whispered and consequences move slowly but decisively, the events of December 5th mark another turning point. Not only for Andrew, not only for Sarah, but for an institution that has begun to lose patience with those who fail to see the cost of their own actions. The coming days will reveal how deep the rupture truly is, and whether this confrontation was the beginning of Andrew's reckoning or merely the calm before an even greater storm.